A widow was lured onto a frozen mountain road during a blizzard, beaten and left to die in the snow with nothing but 3 trembling puppies pressed against her chest. The man who betrayed her believed the storm would erase every trace of what he had done. He never imagined that, deep in the wilderness, a broken war veteran and his loyal dog would hear something in the white silence that night and refuse to walk away. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us. Winter pressed down on the Alaskan highlands like an ancient curse, burying forests, roads, and memories beneath an endless white silence. Snow swallowed the world whole, erasing distance and direction, leaving only wind and cold to rule the land. Jack Miller lived alone in a weather-beaten log cabin tucked deep into the foothills, far from towns or explanations. At 49, he still carried the unmistakable shape of a man who had once been dangerous and now tried very hard not to be. Tall and broad-shouldered, his work-hardened frame had thinned slightly with age, not weakness. His shoulders sloped forward from habit, as if trying to disappear. His face was sharp and weathered, marked by permanent stubble, deep gray-blue eyes that rarely blinked first, and a thin scar through his right eyebrow, an old reminder from a roadside blast overseas. Jack had been a soldier once, though he never spoke about it. He had served in places where nights screamed without warning and survival depended on instincts learned the hard way. When he came home, the war followed him quietly, settling into his bones. Crowds tightened his chest. Sudden noises pulled his hand into a half-fist. Sleep came in fragments, broken by memories that refused to fade. Solitude, he learned, was not loneliness, it was safety. Now he worked when he could, taking logging jobs, repairing engines, fixing fences, anything that paid cash and didn't ask questions. In the nearest town, people knew him as a quiet, reliable laborer who left early and spoke little. The cabin he lived in reflected the man himself. Simple, functional, old but carefully maintained. Thick logs sealed against the cold, a cast-iron stove burning birchwood, a scarred table, a single armchair by the fire, and no photographs on the walls. Only tools, discipline, and habits forged under pressure. At Jack's feet lay Buddy, a 7-year-old German shepherd built for endurance rather than speed. Large even for his breed, Buddy had a powerful chest, disciplined limbs, and a thick double coat of black and tan that protected him from the cold. His ears stood erect even at rest, his dark eyes alert and watchful. He was not a pet in the sentimental sense, but a partner, quiet, purposeful, and unwaveringly loyal. Jack trusted Buddy more than most people. He had found the dog half-starved near a closed ranger station years earlier, and neither of them had needed words to understand the bond that followed. Outside, the storm arrived without ceremony. Wind rose from a low moan into a roaring assault, and snow came sideways, slamming into the cabin walls. Visibility vanished within minutes until the world beyond the windows simply ceased to exist. Inside, Jack sat in his chair cleaning engine parts with slow, precise movements, listening not just to the storm, but through it, the stove cracking, the cabin shifting as the wind tested its strength. Weather like this did not frighten him. Panic wasted energy, and energy was life. Then Buddy moved. The dog's head snapped up, muscles tightening, ears angling toward the door. A low, controlled sound vibrated in his chest. Neither bark nor growl. Jack froze, every instinct from the war surfacing without permission. He followed Buddy's gaze, wiped frost from the window, and saw nothing but white chaos. Then Buddy let out a single sharp woof, urgent and wrong. Jack felt it deep in his chest. This was not weather. This was not wildlife. Whatever the blizzard was hiding, Buddy had found it first, and Jack knew that stepping outside would change everything that followed. Jack stepped into the blizzard as if crossing a threshold he could not uncross. The wind tore at his jacket instantly, clawing for exposed skin, forcing his breath short and sharp. Snow moved sideways in violent sheets, swallowing sound and distance alike, and within seconds the cabin behind him became nothing more than a darker blur in the white. Buddy surged ahead without hesitation, his body low, powerful legs driving through drifts that reached Jack's knees. The dog did not look back. He didn't need to. Jack followed because every instinct he trusted was already moving forward. The world shrank to fragments. Wind, cold, the rhythm of his own breathing, the dark shape of Buddy cutting through the storm. Jack leaned into each step, reading terrain the way he once read hostile streets and open ground overseas. The storm masked everything, but Buddy worked differently. His nose stayed lifted, catching something faint and fragile that the wind tried to scatter. Every few yards he slowed, recalibrated, then adjusted course with quiet certainty. Jack had seen this before. Not in forests, but in places where lives depended on finding what others had missed. They moved downhill, the land dropping away beneath layers of snow that hid rock and ice alike. Trees thinned, their branches stripped bare by the storm, skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The wind changed here, funneling through the terrain with a deeper, angrier voice. Buddy slowed abruptly near the edge of a ravine, his body going rigid. Jack stopped short behind him, heart thudding, boots sliding dangerously close to nothingness. He crouched and edged forward, careful, controlled, the way he had learned long ago when one wrong step meant you didn't get a second. The ravine yawned open beneath them, its depth disguised by drifting snow. Jack scanned the void, eyes straining against the chaos. At first, there was nothing, just white motion and shadow. Then something dark interrupted the pattern, a shape too straight, too angular to belong to the land. Metal. Jack's chest tightened as recognition set in. A vehicle lay below, overturned and half buried, its outline warped by snow and distance, but unmistakable all the same. There was no road anywhere near this place, no reason for a car to be here, especially not during a storm like this. The realization landed hard and heavy. Whatever happened here was not chance. Jack began his descent slowly, using instinct and muscle memory to guide each movement. Snow gave way beneath his boots, sending him sliding in short, controlled drops. The wind screamed louder at the bottom, trapped between rock walls, carrying with it a smell that made Jack's stomach knot. Fuel, metal, and something else beneath it all. The vehicle came into full view as he reached it, lying on its side like a wounded animal. One window was shattered, the edges rimmed with ice. Jack leaned in, raising his light, and the beam cut through darkness to reveal a human form inside. A woman lay slumped in the driver's seat, unconscious, her body twisted unnaturally by the angle of the wreck. She appeared to be in her early 30s, slender, her build slight but not fragile, the kind shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Her hair, light brown, maybe once neatly kept, clung to her face in frozen strands, matted with snow and streaked dark near her temple. Her skin was pale, almost waxen in the cold, lips tinged blue. Jack noticed the bruises immediately, not random, not scattered. Dark marks shadowed her jaw and neck in patterns that did not belong to an accident. His throat tightened as the truth pressed closer. Then he heard it, a sound so small it barely cut through the wind. A thin, broken whimper that didn't come from the woman. Jack froze, listening again, heart pounding. The sound repeated, weak and desperate. He followed it toward the back of the vehicle, sweeping snow aside with shaking hands. What he saw made something twist painfully in his chest. 3 tiny shapes huddled together beneath a bent metal frame, their bodies pressed tight for warmth that no longer existed. Puppies. German shepherds, only weeks old. Their eyes were barely open, their small chests fluttering rapidly as they fought the cold. One lifted its head, trembling violently before collapsing back against the others. Jack felt anger rise fast and hot. but it was swallowed just as quickly by something colder and more focused. These animals had not wandered here. They had been placed, left. The woman, too. The scene did not speak of misfortune or bad weather. It spoke of intention, of someone who believed the storm would erase responsibility, that the cold would finish what human cruelty had begun. Jack straightened slowly, scanning the ravine, the slopes above, the endless white. Whoever had done this was gone, but the weight of their choice lingered heavily in the air. Buddy stood above them now, framed against the storm, ears forward, eyes fixed on Jack and the wreck below. The dog did not bark. He didn't whine. He simply watched, tense and alert as if guarding the truth of what they had found. Jack looked from the unconscious woman to the 3 freezing puppies and felt the familiar shift inside himself, the quiet, dangerous clarity that came when the world stopped asking and started demanding. This was no longer about weather or chance. Someone had decided these lives were expendable, and Jack knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that finding them here meant he had stepped into a story that was far from over. Jack freed the woman from the wreck with slow, deliberate movements, working against frozen metal and drifting snow. Her body came loose with alarming ease, as if gravity itself had already begun to claim her. She was light in his arms, too light for an adult, and the realization tightened something painful in his chest. She appeared to be in her early 30s, slender and worn thin by more than hunger. Her shoulders were narrow, her limbs delicate but not weak, the kind of build shaped by long days of work and longer nights of worry. Her hair, a muted chestnut brown, hung in frozen strands against her face, streaked dark near her temple where dried blood clung to the skin. Her complexion was pale beneath the cold, freckles barely visible across the bridge of her nose, lips bruised and blue from exposure. She did not wake when Jack lifted her, only released a shallow, uneven breath that fogged weakly in the air. Jack adjusted his grip instinctively, cradling her head against his chest, shielding her from the wind with his own body. He had carried wounded men before, men twice her size, but this felt different. There was no gear, no uniform, no battlefield noise to frame the moment. Just a woman left behind in the snow and the quiet weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. Buddy hovered close, circling with restrained agitation, ears sharp, tail low. The dog sensed the fragility of the moment and stayed near without crowding, his presence steady and grounding. Only after securing the woman did Jack turn to the back of the vehicle. The sight of the 3 puppies struck him harder than he expected. They were impossibly small, no more than a few weeks old, their bodies pressed together in a desperate knot of warmth. Their coats were thin and damp, their ribs fluttering beneath Jack's fingers as he lifted them. One trembled violently, another let out a weak, broken sound that barely cut through the storm. These were not strays. They were cared for once, loved, and then abandoned. Jack tucked them carefully inside his jacket, pressing them against his chest, sharing heat without hesitation. Buddy leaned in briefly, nose brushing one tiny head, then stepped back as if understanding his role was to guard, not interfere. The climb back toward the cabin was grueling. Snow shifted beneath Jack's boots, stealing traction, forcing him to rely on balance and memory rather than sight. The woman remained unconscious, her weight slack against him, breath shallow and irregular. Jack could feel the cold radiating from her through layers of clothing, the early grip of hypothermia tightening its hold. The puppies grew frighteningly still, their tiny bodies rigid against his skin. Jack pressed them closer, sacrificing his own warmth without thought. He had learned long ago that survival was never fair. Sometimes it demanded everything before offering anything in return. As they moved, fragments of the woman's story surfaced in Jack's mind, pieced together from small details rather than words. Her name, he would later learn, was Emily Parker. A young widow, her husband gone, not to war, but to an accident that left no medals and no explanations, just absence. She had a son, 6 years old, sent to live with relatives while she chased work wherever she could find it. The puppies were not companions or luxuries. They were hope. The last thing she owned that could be traded for medicine, for time, for one more chance to keep her child breathing. Someone had known this. Someone had used it. By the time the outline of the cabin emerged through the storm, Jack's muscles burned and his vision had narrowed to white and shadow. He forced the door open and sealed the cold outside, dragging them all into the fragile circle of warmth cast by the fire. He lowered Emily carefully to the floor near the stove, positioning her on her side, checking her breathing, her pulse. Her body shuddered faintly as heat touched frozen skin. Jack laid the puppies beside her, forming a barrier with his own body and Buddy's thick fur to trap what warmth they could. Buddy lay down immediately, pressing his chest against the smallest pup, breathing slow and steady, a living shield. Jack's eyes moved over Emily again, this time with clearer focus. The bruises were unmistakable now, dark marks along her jaw, faint discoloration around her throat, injuries shaped by hands rather than metal or glass. This was no accident, no slide, no misjudged turn in bad weather. Someone had beaten her, lured her into the storm, and left her there believing the cold would finish what they had started. Jack felt anger coil deep and heavy inside him, familiar and controlled, the kind that did not burn out quickly. As the storm howled against the cabin walls, Jack sat back on his heels, watching the slow rise and fall of 4 fragile chests. His mind returned to a single question, looping with relentless precision. If someone was cruel enough to abandon a woman and 3 newborn animals to die in a blizzard, would he truly walk away satisfied? Or was the storm merely meant to erase the evidence, until the one who caused it returned to make sure nothing was left alive? Firelight flickered against the log walls as Jack worked, its glow throwing long, restless shadows across the small cabin. He moved with the calm precision of someone who had learned long ago that panic only stole time. Emily lay on a bed of blankets near the stove, her body slowly surrendering to warmth inch by inch. Jack cut away frozen fabric with a careful hand, exposing skin mottled with cold and bruises that darkened as blood returned to the surface. The injuries told their story without words. Finger-shaped marks along her throat, deep discoloration across her ribs, a split at her brow that had crusted and frozen in the storm. These were not the chaotic wounds of a crash. They were deliberate, personal. Jack's jaw tightened as he cleaned the cuts and wrapped her, his movements steady even as something cold and old stirred behind his eyes. The puppies were worse off than they looked at first glance. Jack dried their thin coats with warmed cloth, rubbing gently but firmly to coax circulation back into their tiny limbs. Buddy lay beside them, 7 years old and built like a living furnace, his thick black and tan coat pressed against their shivering bodies. The dog's breath was slow and measured, his dark eyes fixed on the smallest pup as if willing it to keep breathing. Jack noticed the subtle tremor easing from their frames, the faint pink returning to their gums. Life, stubborn and fragile, refused to let go just yet. He fed the stove again, feeding flame as carefully as he fed hope, mindful not to scorch what the cold had spared. Emily stirred as sensation returned, a soft sound catching in her throat. Her eyelids fluttered open, hazel-green eyes unfocused at first, then sharpening with fear as she took in the unfamiliar room. She was small against the blankets, slender and drawn, her skin pale beneath freckles that hinted at time once spent in gentler sun. Her hair, chestnut brown and tangled, clung to her temples in damp curls. When she tried to sit up, pain stopped her short, and a broken cry escaped before she could swallow it. Jack stepped into her line of sight slowly, hands visible, voice low and even. "Easy. You're safe. Don't move." Her gaze slid past him to the floor, to Buddy, to the 3 tiny bodies nestled against the dog's chest. The sight shattered whatever strength she had left. Tears spilled freely as she reached out, fingers trembling. "They're alive?" The words barely made it out. Jack nodded once. All three. The relief hit her like a wave, carrying everything else with it. Emily sobbed, shoulders shaking despite the pain. Grief and gratitude tangled so tightly they were indistinguishable. Jack let it happen. He had learned that some releases could not be rushed or controlled. When her breathing finally slowed, she wiped at her face with the heel of her hand and looked at him properly for the first time. There was exhaustion there, and fear, but also something sharper, resolve worn thin but not broken. "My name is Emily Parker," she said, voice hoarse. "I'm a widow." The word landed heavy in the room. She explained in fragments at first, then steadier as the truth pushed its way out. Her husband had died in an industrial accident 2 years earlier. No lawsuit, no savings, just debt and a 6-year-old boy who needed medicine she could barely afford. She had sent him to stay with her sister while she chased work wherever she could find it, clinging to any chance to earn enough to keep him well. The puppies, she said, were all she had left to sell. Born from a dog she'd once rescued, meant to be traded for cash that would buy her son time. She trusted a man who offered help, who said he knew the roads, who promised to get her there safely despite the storm. Her voice shook as she described the betrayal, the sudden turn off the main road, the blow she never saw coming, the way he took her money and left her bleeding in the snow. "He said the storm would erase it," she whispered, eyes fixed on the fire, "that no one would come." Jack listened without interruption, the story fitting too cleanly into the marks he had already seen. When she finished, silence settled again, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of wood and the faint breathing of the puppies. Outside, the storm changed its voice. The wind no longer screamed, it sighed. Snow fell straighter, heavier, as if the sky itself were growing tired. Jack noticed it immediately. The quiet after violence had taught him to listen for absence as much as sound. Buddy noticed, too. The dog lifted his head slowly, ears angling toward the door, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. It was not loud. It was controlled, restrained, and unmistakably tense. Jack followed Buddy's gaze to the door, then to the window, where the white outside seemed unnaturally still. The storm weakening should have brought relief. Instead, it tightened something in his gut. Emily saw the change in him and went still, fear flashing across her face. "What is it?" she asked. Jack didn't answer right away. He watched Buddy, trusting the dog's instincts the way he had trusted his own men once. The quiet pressed in, heavy with possibility. Jack thought of the man who had left Emily to die, of the kind of cruelty that counted on weather to finish the job. His mind returned to the question that had followed him since the ravine, sharper now that the fire burned and the storm no longer hid the world. If someone believed the cold would erase his sins, what would he do when the night grew quiet enough to check? Buddy's growl deepened, a warning without words. Jack rose slowly, every sense alert, understanding with cold clarity that the cabin's warmth had not ended the danger. It had merely marked the place where the next decision would be made. The storm's retreat was subtle but unmistakable. The wind no longer battered the cabin with blind fury. It moved now with intent, slipping through the trees in measured breaths. Snow fell straighter, quieter, settling instead of erasing. Jack stood near the window and felt the shift deep in his bones. Nature had been a shield, loud and merciless, and shields like that never lasted. Buddy sensed it too. The dog paced once, slow and deliberate, then stopped near the door, nose lifting as if reading a sentence written in the cold air. His growl returned, not loud, not panicked, but low and steady, a sound that meant recognition. Something familiar had entered the perimeter. Jack didn't ask questions. He trusted the dog's certainty the way he once trusted men who could read the ground under fire. He moved with quiet efficiency, guiding Emily to the back of the cabin where the walls were thickest. She was still weak, her movements careful, but her eyes followed him with understanding. Fear lived there, yes, but also resolve sharpened by betrayal. Jack lowered his voice. "You stay here. No sound." He showed her where to sit, where to hide if she had to, and how to keep the puppies warm and quiet. Emily nodded, pulling the blankets closer around the small bodies, her jaw set. She did not argue. People who had been hunted learned quickly when silence mattered. Jack turned the cabin into something else entirely. What had been shelter became terrain. He dimmed the fire until it barely breathed, enough to keep life but not advertise it. He moved furniture away from windows, broke up sight lines, memorized angles. He stepped outside briefly, letting the cold bite, and read the snow like a map. Tracks had been erased by the storm, but new disturbances told a different story. Compression where snow had settled too cleanly, branches brushed aside where no animal would pass. Whoever it was moved carefully, patiently, a man who knew how to wait. The sound came then, faint but unmistakable. An engine. Not loud, not close. Cut quickly, as if its owner understood that silence traveled farther now. Buddy's ears snapped forward, body going still. Jack felt the familiar narrowing in his chest, the old calm settling in. He was no longer reacting. He was preparing. He circled the cabin wide, boots sinking without haste, using the trees as cover. At the edge of the clearing he saw him. A man, mid-40s perhaps, broad-shouldered beneath a heavy winter coat, face obscured by a hood rimmed with frost. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed the ending had already been written. He stopped where the ravine trail bent toward the cabin and looked around, head tilting slightly, as if listening for a mistake. Jack didn't engage. He didn't need to. This was not about confrontation yet. This was about time. He slipped back inside and took position where he could watch without being seen. Buddy lay at his feet, muscles coiled, eyes fixed on the door, awaiting permission that had not yet been given. Minutes passed, stretching thin. Then footsteps. Slow. Crunching. The man circled the cabin once, twice, testing silence with movement. He paused near a window, leaning close, breath fogging the glass before he wiped it away with a gloved hand. Jack stayed still, counting heartbeats, letting the man believe the cabin empty or abandoned. Letting doubt grow. Emily held the puppies and listened, every sense stretched tight. She heard the scrape of boots, the faint tap against wood, and felt the old terror try to reclaim her breath. She fought it down, focusing on the warmth of the small lives in her arms. Somewhere beyond the wall, Buddy's growl deepened, a promise rather than a warning. Jack shifted just enough to change his silhouette, ready to draw the man deeper into uncertainty. He wasn't here to win. He was here to delay, to exhaust, to make every step cost more than the hunter expected. The man tried the door at last. Not a kick, a careful test. It held. He stepped back, scanning the tree line, weighing risk. Jack saw the calculation in the man's posture, the pause of someone deciding whether to commit. That was the moment Jack understood with cold clarity that this would not end with a simple retreat. If the man chose to enter, it would no longer be about defense. It would be about survival. Buddy rose silently, waiting for the signal that had not yet come, as the quiet outside pressed closer, thinner, and more dangerous than the storm that had passed. The quiet broke without warning, not with a shout or a gunshot, but with the unmistakable crack of wood under pressure. Jack felt it through the floor before he heard it, the doorframe groaning as weight leaned into it from the outside. Snow drifted lazily through the air now, the storm's last breath settling over the clearing like a false mercy. Jack's senses narrowed, every sound sharp and precise. He shifted his stance, bracing himself just as the door shuttered again. The man had chosen to commit. There would be no retreat. Jack moved to block the entrance, body angled, feet planted wide despite the ache already burning through his muscles. When the door burst inward, cold rushed into the cabin like a living thing. The intruder filled the doorway, A broad man, wrapped in a heavy winter parka, beard iced white, eyes hard and fixed with the confidence of someone who believed he owned the ending. He smelled of fuel and sweat, of long hours alone with his certainty. Jack saw the knife flash in the man's gloved hand and felt the old switch flip inside him, the one that silenced doubt and stripped action down to its bones. They collided in the doorway, wood splintering beneath their boots. Jack drove his shoulder forward, using the narrow space to limit movement, absorbing the first blow with a grunt as pain flared along his ribs. The knife scraped across his arm, hot, then numb, blood seeping quickly into the sleeve of his jacket. He ignored it, locked his weight into the man's center, and shoved hard, forcing him back into the snow. The intruder staggered, cursed, then surged forward again, rage replacing calculation. Jack felt the strain in his legs, the cold gnawing at his joints, but he held, breath ragged, refusing to give ground. Inside, Emily heard the impact and froze. She pulled the puppies closer, pressing them against her chest, their tiny bodies trembling in response to the chaos. Fear surged, sharp and suffocating. But she did not scream. She had learned the cost of noise. Buddy, who had been coiled like a spring near the back wall, shot forward at the sound of Jack's strained breath. The dog moved not with fury, but with purpose, muscles unleashing years of instinct in a single blur of motion. The intruder stepped past the threshold at last, one boot inside the cabin, knife raised. That was when Buddy hit him. The German shepherd struck low and fast, jaws clamping onto the man's forearm with bone-rattling force. The scream that followed was raw and animal, torn loose by shock and pain. The knife dropped, skidding across the floor. The man flailed, trying to shake the dog free, but Buddy held on. Feet braced, eyes locked with ferocious focus. Jack seized the opening, lunging forward despite the dizziness creeping into his vision, and drove the man back out into the snow. They fell together, a tangle of limbs and breath, the cold biting through fabric and skin alike. Jack felt the world tilt, felt warmth spill down his side where the cut had deepened. He forced himself upright, one hand pressing hard against the wound, the other reaching blindly for balance. The intruder scrambled backward, clutching his injured arm, terror finally cracking the certainty on his face. He tried to run. The sound of engines cut through the clearing before he made it 10 steps. At first it was distant, a low, mechanical growl swallowed by trees. Then it grew louder, closer, undeniable. Jack heard it and felt his knees weaken with relief and exhaustion colliding at once. He turned his head just enough to see lights flashing through the falling snow, rescue vehicles breaking through the white, following the emergency signal he had triggered hours earlier when the storm first showed signs of lifting. The intruder froze, realization dawning too late. He bolted again, but Buddy released him only long enough to lunge once more, knocking him face first into the snow where he was quickly pinned by arriving responders. Jack didn't watch the arrest. He didn't hear the shouted commands or the snap of restraints. The fight left him all at once draining away like warmth from an open door. He took a step, then another, and the world narrowed to a thin, wavering line. Snow brushed his cheek as he fell, the cold seeping into him with startling gentleness. He lay there, breath shallow, staring up at the pale sky as figures moved around him in blurred shapes. Somewhere nearby, Buddy barked once, sharp, urgent, then pressed close, his body a solid, living weight against Jack's side. Emily emerged from the cabin only when it was safe, guided by gloved hands. She saw Jack lying there, blood dark against the snow, and dropped to her knees beside him without hesitation. Her hands shook as she pressed them over the wound, tears streaking down her face. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice breaking. Jack tried to answer, but the words tangled before they reached his lips. He felt warmth return where Buddy leaned into him, felt hands working with practiced speed, felt himself being lifted. As the rescuers moved him toward safety, Jack drifted at the edge of a consciousness, aware only of fragments. The steady beat of a heart monitor, the muffled whine of engines, the weight lifting from his chest. He did not know yet whether he would live or die. But as darkness pulled at him, one truth remained clear, steady as a promise he had kept all his life. He had not left them behind. Spring came late to the Alaskan highlands, cautious and quiet, as if the land itself needed reassurance before letting go of winter. Snow still clung to the shadows of trees, but sunlight now lingered longer on the cabin walls, melting ice into slow, patient streams. Jack Miller watched it from the porch, wrapped in a thick jacket, his movements still measured after months of recovery. The scars on his side had healed into pale lines, but the deeper wounds, the ones that tightened his chest at night, were only just beginning to loosen. Buddy lay stretched at his feet, older now in posture if not in years, his once restless vigilance softened into something closer to peace. Jack had survived. That fact alone had surprised him in the weeks after the rescue, when pain and exhaustion blurred together in the small regional hospital. Doctors called him lucky. Emily called him stubborn. Jack knew the truth lived somewhere in between. He returned to the cabin thinner, quieter, carrying more silence than before, but the silence no longer felt empty. Emily had stayed nearby during his recovery, first out of necessity, then by choice. She had changed, too. The fear that once haunted her eyes had been replaced by something steadier, forged through loss and survival. She stood taller now, her slender frame no longer shrinking inward. Her chestnut hair, once tangled by storm and panic, fell neatly to her shoulders, and her hazel eyes held a calm determination shaped by motherhood and grief alike. The day her son arrived was warm enough for jackets to remain open. Noah Parker stepped out of the truck with cautious curiosity, a small boy with dark hair and serious eyes too old for his years. Illness had once drained the color from his cheeks, but now health had returned, slow and steady. He studied Jack from behind Emily's leg, uncertain but observant. Jack knelt despite the ache in his joints, lowering himself to the boy's height. "You must be Noah," he said simply. Noah nodded, then glanced past him as the puppies, no longer tiny, tumbled into view. Laughter broke free before fear could stop it. That sound, bright and unguarded, settled something deep inside Jack that years of solitude never could. The three puppies had grown strong and clumsy, their coats thick and glossy, each carrying a hint of the dog they would become. Buddy tolerated them with the patience of an old soldier among recruits, correcting gently, guarding always. He watched Noah with particular interest, allowing small hands to grip his fur, accepting the boy into his quiet circle of trust. Emily noticed it too. "He's chosen us," she said softly one evening as they watched the dogs play in the fading light. Jack didn't answer right away. He had learned not to rush truths that mattered. Life rebuilt itself in small, ordinary ways. Jack took work again, not drifting this time, but choosing jobs that brought him back before dark. Emily found steady employment in town, her confidence returning with each passing week. The cabin changed almost without Jack noticing. Extra blankets folded neatly, a child's boots by the door, laughter echoing where only wind once lived. When Emily asked him to stay, she did not frame it as a debt or reward. She said it plainly, honestly. "We're better together." Jack understood the weight of that invitation. It was heavier than any medal he had never claimed. On the first evening, they ate together at the rough wooden table. Jack watched Noah struggle with his fork and felt something unfamiliar and fragile bloom in his chest. Not fear, not vigilance. Hope, tentative and unpracticed. Buddy settled nearby, head on his paws, eyes half closed in the glow of lamplight. The war that had followed Jack home all those years ago loosened its grip, not because it was defeated, but because it was finally answered by something stronger. Later, as dusk settled over the melting snow, Jack stood on the porch again, Buddy beside him, the cabin behind filled with warmth and voices. He thought of all the men he had known who never made it home, and those who did but never truly returned. He understood now that survival was not the same as belonging. Some soldiers, he realized, did not fall on battlefields. They simply wandered afterward, waiting for a place brave enough to hold what they carried. As the last light faded and Buddy shifted closer, Jack allowed himself a quiet certainty he had never trusted before. He had not found peace in victory or silence or solitude. He had found it here, after the storm, in shared mornings and guarded smiles, in a family formed not by blood, but by choice. And for the first time since the war, Jack Miller knew where he belonged. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or blazing light. They come quietly, through a person who refuses to walk away, through a loyal dog, through a hand reaching out in the middle of a storm. That may be how God works. He does not always appear himself, but he places the right people in the right moment. If today you feel tired, alone, or forgotten, remember this: you are still seen, and the light is still coming, even if it feels delayed. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment to tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that heal. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He be your shelter in the storm and your light on the path ahead. Amen.